Then there's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, legislative priorities, and other related issues that make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Dave Cortese is the newly elected senator representing California's 15th Senate District, the South Bay Area heart of Santa Clara County and Silicon Valley. Yes, Senator Cortese is a freshman face in the California legislature, but he's hardly a newcomer to public policy and government leadership. And his bond with the California state legislature arcs over the years, since now he represents most of the cities and communities that were served by his father, Dominic Cortese, during his distinguished 15-year term in the California State Assembly during the 1980s and 90s. Indeed, Senator Cortese grew up in the district he represents, and prior to being sworn into the state Senate last fall, he had spent most of the last decade as a member of the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors, including 4 years as board president. And prior to county service, he served 8 years on the San Jose City Council, and the 8 years before that as a trustee for the East Side Union High School District in San Jose. Senator Cortese has already been appointed chair of the Senate Committee on Labor, Public Employment, and Retirement, and brings to Sacramento a policy portfolio focused on 21st century California priorities, including workplace fairness, climate change, housing affordability and accessibility, criminal justice reform, sexual assault prevention, and youth services, a sample of which we hope to touch upon during this conversation. Senator Cortese joins us by phone here on a Tuesday evening as we speak after what I'm sure has been a busy day at the state capitol for some dinner hour podcasting. Senator Dave Cortese, welcome to Then There's California.
Oh, thank you, Brian. I'm very happy to be here. It's really my pleasure. And as you know, it's a time like no other to serve in the state legislature. For one thing, we still have barricades around the Capitol.
Yes.
But probably the more profound ramifications of what we've just been through over the years with the Trump administration, those of us who are part of the Democratic caucus are still working hard to unravel some of what happened over the last 4 years in terms of pass down from the federal government or not, areas where we haven't had resources. And of course, besides the pandemic, which would be enough of a crisis if we had no other, we do have others. We have a housing crisis. Globally, we're in the middle of a climate crisis. Within the housing crisis, we have a homelessness crisis in the state, and the list goes on. And, whether you're talking about mental health or other safety net services that are just stretched right now in the state of California, it's not as if you can do policy or cast a vote these days without feeling profoundly impacted or that you're profoundly impacting others.
Right, and your your welcome to the state Senate, like with many of your colleagues, you've hit the ground running. Let's talk about that transitional experience, a very familiar one to many of your colleagues who came to the legislature from local government, of calibrating yourself to a state government lens. And yet, prior to your local government service, you had a career in the banking industry and running the family business. So you bring that private sector background to the table here at the Capitol. And it actually sounds like your policy priorities as a county official, particularly for the past decade, are aligning pretty smoothly with your plans and intentions and the priorities as a state senator.
Yeah, it's very true. The issues are by and large the same. I'm very comfortable with the issues. In fact, if anything, I'm exuberant at the opportunity to deal with these big issues that we're dealing with as a state, but they're also the same issues I was dealing with as a county supervisor. And I happen to have been a county supervisor on a relatively big stage as counties go. The largest county in the Bay Area, Santa Clara County, and a county that was at the forefront of a number of national models and national initiatives on policy that really help inform who I am and what I do here in the state Senate. So that part of the transition is really pretty cool. Here I was working on a national model to create guaranteed income, UBI, for foster children, the first of its kind in Santa Clara County. Now I'm in the position to introduce legislation to do the same thing at the state level. But more importantly, whether I introduce the legislation or not, the issue of foster children, their transition, what we do to create the proper safety net for them, again, is the same whether you're dealing with 58 counties or just the one county I came from. So as you can see, that part of it is very much hand in glove. It feels that way. Procedure, that's another story. There's no county in the state that's on a bicameral system like this, so I'm learning a lot.
That's true. A few more colleagues you have to negotiate and collaborate with than perhaps what you're used to on the dais of the Board of Supervisors. You know, I'm humbled to think that I am one of the few Capitol staffers still around who had the privilege of working with your dad, former Assemblyman Dominic Cortese, who served in the lower house from 1980 into 1996. He came from local government leadership, like you have. He served as chair of the Assembly Local Government and the Assembly Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committees. And what I can remember about Assemblyman Dom Cortese is that he obviously had his progressive priorities, circa 80s and 90s, in serving the Assembly Democratic Caucus and his Assembly district. But he was, as a lawmaker, if I recall, a really independent spirit.
Yeah, he was, and I should say he's 88 years old now. He's doing well, and he would appreciate very much that you have fond recollections of his service in the state capitol. I'll certainly let him know. Yeah, he came out of a farming and business background. In fact, his ballot designation was almost always rancher/businessman. And that really kind of helps tell the story of how does somebody come out of that background and end up landing in what we would now call the progressive category on so many issues. He stood with United Farm Workers, even though he was a grower. He marched with Cesar Chavez. He advocated for a more robust safety net. In his day, what was called welfare assistance, we now call general assistance.
Right.
He was that person, right? He was once named Sierra Club Legislator of the Year. Yet, he was very welcomed in places like the Central Valley or more conservative areas of the district. He often had bipartisan support, and he often had bipartisan support on his bills, not just among the electorate. You know, maybe it was a different era, but he somehow seemed to be a blend of those two worlds. And, you know, I often heard him say, just be yourself. That was his advice to others. Well, when he was being himself, he was both. He was a progressive Democrat, but he was also someone deeply rooted in property values and in farming values and in business values that so often now tend to polarize people in the state capitol. That was something I don't think you saw as much back then.
Well, you bring up a good point. California was, some for worse and for better, a different state during his time, during your dad's career, than it is now. But how has your public service career been influenced by him and his legislative portfolio and his time and everything that you've just described?
You know, I think he, first and foremost, he was, by all accounts, respected as a gentleman, as a person of integrity and character, particularly in terms of dealing with his colleagues, his peers, the folks that came in and out of his office. And that's something that's probably more important to me than anything else. There's times when you're chairing a committee or when you're trying to make a point where you have to be pretty assertive and direct with people. But you know, I'd like to come away from this experience having people say even a small percentage of what I hear about him, even if I could live up to half of that reputation of being a classy individual, a person of character, a person of good faith. That's what I would call it. Someone whose word you could depend on. I hear that over and over again from folks who still serve in one capacity or another in Sacramento in public service. Most recently as this morning, I had a phone call with Senator Umberg, who said some of those same things, you know, about my father because he overlapped with him in terms of his tenure.
Right, in the state assembly. They both served together, yes.
So, yes, I know what you're really asking is, you know, am I a progressive with deep business roots also? And did my father's career influence that? I mean, his whole life influenced that. You know, I was a generational family farmer. I was a generational family business person. I ended up getting in politics at a young age like he did, and now I'm here. So it stands to reason I'd have a lot of the same philosophy. But like I said, what's even more important to me is to come away with a sense of respect from my colleagues that while I was here, you know, I served well and I worked hard.
Thank you for that great profile and great legacy that you're sharing. Let's take a look at your 15th Senate district. And as I alluded to at the outset, some of that used to be his district, but it's your district now. It's a district that has its roots in agriculture, as you have talked about, which, of course, makes sense if you look at the terra firma around it. But it is now dominated by a Silicon Valley economy, not all of it, but a good part of it. That's what it's known for. But it is also a very diverse district, too, correct?
Yes, it is. All of the things that you just said, there's still 15,000 agricultural workers in Santa Clara County. The original Silicon Valley still has 15,000 agricultural workers, 12,000 agricultural acres that it's seeking to preserve in agriculture in the flatlands. That doesn't even get into the chaparral lands and so forth. We had the second largest of the wildfires in the state's history of this past year, the second largest in history in Santa Clara County. It gives you an idea how much rural acreage there still is in Santa Clara County, yet it's the home of Apple Computer, of HP, of eBay, of all of these, there's at least 24 driving industries, tech leaders, of course, which find their home here. So what was once the Valley of Heart's Delight is of course now Silicon Valley, but it still carries with it as a district both worlds to some degree. And probably more importantly, in terms of diversity, while it's true we were always somewhat of a diverse community, whether it was, the influx seasonally of migrant farm workers or the large Japanese American community that's there, the large Chinese American and other Asian communities, the Vietnamese community, which has over 100,000 of its diaspora in Santa Clara County. Now there's over 100 different dialects and languages spoken as primary languages in the homes in my district.
Incredible.
So diversity is off the charts now, off the charts. We thought we were diverse 40 years ago. Now we're just off the charts.
I know that those diverse and immigrant communities in your district have been foremost in your thoughts and priorities as our state deals with the COVID pandemic and as the state's vaccine distribution plan has been unveiled. Early in the month of March, you and a handful of your fellow Bay Area legislators raised your collective voices on behalf of those communities that were hard hit by the COVID-19 infection rates that were twice that of the state's overall rate. And at the time, only 2%, this is early March, only 2% of the Bay Area residents appeared to be living in zip codes being prioritized for nearly half of the available doses of the COVID-19 vaccine through the state's vaccine distribution formula. You'd been in discussions with the governor's office about bringing some sort of equity to the vaccine rollout for these communities. How has the response been since you called this concern to the governor's attention?
I know the governor's office, on the one hand, is doing everything they can in terms of good faith and goodwill to get the entire state vaccinated as soon as possible. But there were some bumps in the way that the vaccine rollout happened from an equity standpoint. Santa Clara County really got literally left out of that disposition. So what's happening now is, you have to look ahead. When's the next wave of vaccine coming in? What do we do with that supply? How can we make amends? How can we redistribute that vaccine that will be coming here in the next week or two in a way that addresses equity? And how can we get some money to the clinics, to the federally qualified clinics that we have, in our case, a massive network of in Santa Clara County? How can we get them a little bit more capacity, financial capacity, to make sure that they can get that vaccine out? When you ask them to get 1,000 shots out instead of 500 in a day, you also need to help them with their capacity a little bit. So all of those things are on the table. I made it sound like more things than it really is. Vaccine supply, flexibility, and a little bit of financial support to correct that problem. And I think the governor's office is still likely to come through based on the conversations I heard.
Well, that's great. And I know everybody is working hard to get as many needles and as many arms, as many Californians as possible. So I'm glad that you and your network of Bay Area, North Bay, South Bay, San Francisco legislators are working on this. As mentioned, you are also the newly appointed chair of the Senate Labor, Public Employment, and Retirement Committee, a topic of which, of course, takes on special urgency and resonance in these pandemic months of 2021. California's workplace landscape has changed perhaps irrevocably as a result of COVID, with the majority of California's white-collar workers working from home, the essential workers still arriving in person to their jobs as they have been all this last year at the risk of the virus, and the rest of California's workforce having lost their jobs to the economic retraction of the job market this past year. And the sadness and tragedy of that scenario has played out most especially vividly in the controversy surrounding California's Employment Development Department. You, as a senator, have called on the EDD to reform and revamp these fiscal and logistical issues that are harming California's unemployed workers and, by extension, with all of the money, all of the taxpayers in the state. Talk about the efforts that you and your colleagues are doing to break this logjam and help out unemployed Californians.
Well, yesterday in the Labor Committee, we got a bill out of committee that Senator Umberg brought forward that would bring to bear tremendous resources from the AG's office to go through and try to get restitution on some of that fraud. Much of that implementation system occurred while I was a county supervisor just before I got to the state Senate. So yes, I was taken aback, really appalled by the breakdowns, the lack of implementation, but more than anything, the vulnerability to that system for fraud. I mean, we've seen some references in audit reports that there may have been, at least on the federal reimbursement side, as much as 27% fraud in those claims. Some of that's organized crime. Some of that may be near impossible to collect. But the legislature and my committee was certainly focused on doing whatever we can to recoup taxpayer money, to catch those folks who were defrauding the system, and to prosecute them under the laws of the state of California to whatever extent possible. So that's the next step. In the meanwhile, I'll be blunt. I mean, the EDD has got to turn itself around. You can't have an organization like that so responsible for the direct well-being of our residents in California during their times of hardship. You just can't have an agency with that responsibility be so broken and so fragile that it just falls apart like this when people need it most. So you will see additional legislation and direction that, attempts to cure that problem once and for all, puts safeguards, guardrails, and plans in place, including recessionary plans, so that the next time they get hit with a big surge like this, they're ready for it. Those are really the steps we can take at this point, but it's not something I'm happy about, and certainly not something anyone in the legislature is happy about.
Looking at your legislative priorities in the state Senate and how they mirror your policy priorities as a local government leader, I want to do just a very quick lightning round of bill references and topics that you are working on in Sacramento. And one issue that you and the rest of your caucus are focused on is environmental leadership. And you've hit the ground running with this legislative package related to that, particularly addressing climate change through the efforts of building decarbonization. And as the governor mandates that the state move to carbon-neutral transportation alternatives, the buildings we work in and live in, as you say, should be built and transformed with that same mandate in mind.
Yeah, we brought out a package of bills literally on swearing-in day back on December 7th. We both remember that day. I think we did an interview back then.
Yes, we did. We did a welcome interview.
Right. And later that day, in print, were four of my bills, SB 31, 32, SB 30, I didn't mean to skip that one, and then also SB 37. But 30, 31, and 32 are all various levels of decarbonization work that we believe needs to be done. With SB 30, that has to do with state buildings and assets. And what we're trying to do is require that new state buildings, as they're constructed, are constructed with dramatically reduced emissions. We'd like to see them 100% electrified wherever possible. We think on the one hand, it's a doable and modest goal. There's only so many new state buildings coming online. But on the other hand, it puts the state in the position, once again, of being an early adopter of best practices going forward on climate. SB 31, which we call the Decarbonization Programs Act of 2021, is really about programs. The California Energy Commission, the Public Utility Commission, provides grants mostly for low-income customers that can pay for decarbonization efforts and other kinds of reduced emission efforts that those low-income customers may want to put into play. So what we're trying to do there is to make sure that those grant applications reward folks for electrification if that's indeed what they want to do. SB32, the last of the package in terms of decarbonization, is just simply called the Decarbonization Act of 2021. And that's really asking the cities and counties, as they update their general plans, which most of them do on a regular cycle, that they install objectives, targets, and policies to decarbonize their building stock in line with state targets. And if they're not going to do that, to establish what, in fact, their targets are in terms of local control so that the world can see what they're doing. So those three are very important to us. They're tough bills. They're statewide bills, obviously, in terms of the implications. And then to some degree, they're global bills because California, frankly, has been leading the world in terms of these kind of efforts. So nothing that you try to do that's that big is easy, but we've certainly developed a tremendous amount of support, bill sponsors, supporters, and we're going to keep plugging away on those and try to get them through.
Well, I also know sexual assault prevention policy has also been a longtime focus of yours, and you bring those priorities with you to the legislature, as you had also as a county supervisor. And just this week, you had a press conference to announce a new bill that will tighten the lax laws in this state related to spousal rape, which are looser and less punitive than other laws related to rape. Tell us about SB 530.
Yeah, SB 530, I think, is a long time in coming. You know, there's 39 states that have already done away with any code section that refers to spousal rape. People hear this and are wondering, well, then what do you do about spousal rape? We believe that spousal rape is rape, and that distinction or that preface, spousal, shouldn't exist, that our rape laws and the penalties, therefore, are clear. And it shouldn't matter whether somebody is a spouse who is a victim or a perpetrator or not. And the way the laws are set up in the state of California right now, rape between spouses as to the perpetrator results in a far lesser penalty than if somebody were to rape a non-spouse. And we think that's just not only an artificial distinction, but an archaic distinction that probably goes back to a mindset from hundreds of years ago in terms of viewing women particularly as chattels. So we're trying to do away with that, but like any bill, it will certainly hit its bumps in the road along the way, so we'll have our work cut out for us.
Well, definitely some progressive public policy you're working on. Finally, just to wrap here, and let's talk about things that are going on right now as we speak. The U.S. and our communities are reeling from violent and shocking gun episodes of recent days. The mass shootings that occurred at 3 spas and massage parlors in the metropolitan area of Atlanta, Georgia, where 6 of the 8 people killed were Asian women. And then another mass shooting occurred in Boulder, Colorado, where a gunman opened fire at a grocery store, killing 10 people. And notwithstanding the racial violence epidemic that the Atlanta shooting has brought back into the public debate, the common denominator in both of these tragedies is guns. And we're talking about gun violence again because we felt like we got a break from it during this last pandemic year, but that never actually happened. Last year, 41,000 people, a record in modern history, even during a pandemic, died in shootings. So it's not stopping. I know that you did your part to address gun violence prevention and gun safety during your time as a Santa Clara County supervisor. We have the strictest laws in the country, gun laws here in California. Where does the gun debate go now, in your opinion, in the wake of these shootings, if it goes anywhere?
Well, I think nationally we need to adopt the same kind of regulatory scheme in terms of what it takes to acquire a gun, the kind of cross-systems coordination that we now have in the state of California around mental health and the ability to acquire a gun. None of that exists in most of the states in the union still, and that's a tragedy. And that's why you hear President Biden talking about things that sound like we've already done that here. Background checks, certain laws about assault weapons and automatic weapons or semi-automatic weapons. A lot of that work's been done here in California, but hasn't been done in the rest of the country. Not to say we don't have a problem here in California, and we do. You know, it was my county where the Gilroy Garlic Festival shooting happened.
That's right, just a couple of years ago.
It's nauseating to hear this happen in Boulder or Atlanta. It's particularly nauseating when it happens in your own, home county, and you have to go to the funerals and you have to grieve the 14-year-old girl who was autistic, who was trying to run away from a crazed shooter who probably had a mental health condition based on our understanding and should have never been handling a firearm in the first place. So we've got to take a deeper dive into these issues. I'm an outdoors person. I grew up in a rural environment, as we talked about earlier. I don't fear the safe use of firearms for purposes like hunting and outdoor activities. For some farmers, it's almost a tool of the trade. If you're somewhere in the Central Valley, for example, or up in the mountains. But we need them to come to the table with us, those folks who understand firearms the best amongst us, to help us craft laws that will keep guns out of the hands of felons and out of the hands of people who don't currently have the mental capacity to have one. Those are our two biggest problems right there. 70% of the firearms that are out there in the hands of somebody who's creating a problem are in the hands of a felon or somebody with a clinically diagnosed mental health problem that probably shouldn't have been walking around with that gun in the first place. If we could take care of that, we will have come a long way, and we need to do it not just here, but across the country.
Well said. I read somewhere in your biography that you had the experience as a child of hearing President John F. Kennedy speak during a visit to San Jose, and then you saw him in his motorcade as he rode through town. And I'm sure that was a life or ambition-altering experience for you, and perhaps helped plant the seeds of public service that you have reaped in your career. So here in the third decade of the 21st century, is it possible for a young person in 2021 to be inspired by a galvanizing leader? Maybe it's Justice Sonia Sotomayor or Vice President Kamala Harris, but inspired like you were by John F. Kennedy, or even like you were by your father, Dom Cortese.
Boy, I hope so, Brian, because you don't hear that much anymore. I don't. And maybe I'm not among school children as much as I used to be, but when I was a kid growing up, one of the most common questions somebody would ask you is, what are you going to be when you grow up? President of the United States? It was an aspiration. And I fear that we've lost that we don't instill in the minds of our young people anymore, that politicians, elected officials who do the job right are doing a noble vocation, a noble profession, and that it's something to aspire to. And it's a good thing to aspire to. And that there are people in Washington, D.C. and in Sacramento who are looking to take care of the young people in our community and to make sure that they have every opportunity that every American should have as they grow up. We've lost some of that. And yes, I was brought up not only with an early opportunity to see John F. Kennedy in a parade motorcade right behind what is now the convention center in downtown San Jose, but in my house, once he was elected, there was a colored portrait in the family room of the President of the United States. How often do you see that anymore?
Yeah,
and my
true.
Father wasn't a politician then. My father was still a farmer when that portrait was hung up on the wall. And we weren't the only ones. There were other families in other homes that you'd visit of your friends where you would see that kind of reverence toward the great leaders of our country. And God, we've fallen so far back. Clearly, the Trump administration set us back what feels like 500 years, not just 200 years. And it's a disservice to our young people, and especially that diversity that you were referring to earlier. We have a first generation here of young people whose parents have come from all over the world. And not all those places in the world is there a proper reverence for democracy, for freedom, for human rights. And there's not the same kind of general respect we have for government officials that we generally have here. It's our obligation, I think, to inspire this new generation of young people to take the mantle of leadership. And I'm so glad, at least now at the high school and college level, to see movements like the Sunrise Movement and others where young people are re-engaging. It's so critical to our future.
Senator, thank you so much for your time. I know it's been a long day. I know it's not ending. You have more in your schedule, but I want to free you up to continue to do your work and maybe go get some dinner. And I just want to thank you for this chance for Californians to get to know you a little better through this podcast conversation. Good luck with your legislative year, and I hope we can do this again before too long. Senator Cortese, thanks for joining us on Then There's California.
No, thank you, Brian. We're lucky to have you. Thank you very much for the great job you do.
Wow, thank you, Senator. You are very kind.
See you soon.
That brings us to a close of this edition of Then There's California, a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus, with technical and production support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulty, Brian Shadden, and Rainier Sabiniano, John Roman, McLeana Woods, Gunjan Patel, Ann DeGrazia, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Dave Cortese of San Jose, from California's 15th Senate District, I'm Brian Green at the state capitol in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.